You're listening to the For I Will Be With You podcast. For I Will Be With You. Daily reflections on recovery from the Bible.
Welcome back to the For I Will Be With You podcast for the 31st week of the year from July 29th to August 4th, covering Leviticus 19:18 to Leviticus 23:21. So we're in the section of Leviticus where God is giving additional commandments to the Israelites and to the priests, also known as the Kohanim or the Kohanes of the Israelite nation. And there's a lot we can learn from these for addiction recovery. Leviticus 19:18 reads, "You shall not take revenge, and you shall not bear a grudge against the members of your people. You shall love your fellow as yourself. I am God." So this is one of the most famous lines in the entire Bible. You shall love your fellow as yourself. It's also rendered as love thy neighbor as thyself and other phrasings, but it's the same idea. In contrast, I think we see a lot of the opposite in the rooms, or people working on recovering from the opposite. Like I have an AA friend in Los Angeles who just used to describe himself. He said before he got sober, he said he was a world-class hater. Wow. Imagine that, a world-class hater. What a way to go through life. Revenge and grudges are totally natural. They're very human. We all have them. We all want to take revenge at some point, and we all probably have nurtured a grudge at one time or another. Maybe we still are. I know I struggle with it still, even after 15 years of sobriety, and a lot of work on not doing that. But revenge and grudges are big problems in sobriety and recovery. They tend to hold us in the grip, usually with toxic effect. And what's ironic about it is when we hold the grudge against someone else, we are really the ones who are trapped by it. The other person may not even know that he or she isn't the object of such intense feelings. We're the ones suffering, and our sobriety suffers, usually to the point where we want to drink and use again. The Bible understands this, commanding the Israelites not to take revenge and hold grudges. God understands that the community will fall apart if we do not love our fellows as we love ourselves. Now, just as a little bit of an interesting tangent, the classic interpretation of this famous verse of love thy neighbor as yourself is a little different from what most of us imagine. One of the interpretations that really comes through is that the idea is that we should want our fellows to have what we have. That's a good definition of loving your fellow as yourself. Considering how much resentment and coveting and envy drives grudges, this makes a lot of sense. Whatever you have, they should have. Not whatever they have you want and don't get and feel bad about. Leviticus 21:1 and 21:2 reads, "And the Lord said to Moses, Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, Let none of you defile himself for a dead person among his people, except for his relative who is close to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother." So what this means is a very technical instruction, but it's important in spiritual terms. A priest, one of the Israelite priests, were not allowed to be in contact with a dead body or even visit a cemetery, except for funerals of very specific direct family members as described. So, the idea is that death conveys spiritual contamination, which can render the priest unable to perform the services in the temple or the tabernacle. So it's a sort of an abstract concept, meaning if the priest is supposed to bring us offerings in the temple, if the priest has had contact with a dead body, he's unfit to do the service, and then he has to go through a ritual of bathing and so forth to decontaminate himself, so to speak. And what's interesting today, even today, the descendants of the priests in the Jewish people who are called the Kohanim, and sometimes if you meet a person named Cohen, they're actually a member of this group, they will not go to a cemetery still, and sometimes they don't become doctors because they don't want to touch dead bodies and so forth. They're trying to preserve, it's a custom to this day. They will only go to a cemetery to bury a close relative. Now, for our purposes in recovery, this actually has a lot of meaning if we look at it the right way. The message for us as recovering addicts is to minimize our contact with people who are spiritually dead, unless it's absolutely necessary. If we have time, if we're able to guide others, we're like the priests. We have a holy purpose. Extended involvement, we can be like the priests of, so to speak, of recovery. We can be the leaders if we have something to share that's of value, if we have time and experience. And if we want to do that, extended involvement with toxic people who are basically dead in spiritual terms, meaning they've stopped trying to heal, can be damaging to our spiritual integrity. We have to be judicious regarding how much of ourselves we give over to them. Of course, like the priest's close relatives, certain close friends and special individuals deserve our attention, even if it puts our own spiritual wellness at risk. And another way to think about it is, if you're going to deal with toxic people in recovery, like if you're going to be doing 12-step calls and other things, you have to be sure your own program is in pretty good order, because otherwise the spiritual sort of contamination of people who you're dealing with may really affect you. That's a difficulty in the program, that you have to really know yourself. So, continuing with this verse, Leviticus 21:22, and it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, Speak to the priests, the son of Aaron, and say to them, Let none of you defile himself with a dead person." There's a redundancy, apparently, in this verse. First, Moses is instructed by God to speak to the priests, and then it says, say to them. So it's not necessary to say it twice. So, as always, when the Bible offers a repetition of words or a confusing set of words, it's never by accident. It's always a flag that means we should dig deeper and understand the meaning. So one interpretation is that it's just for emphasis. It's like saying, this is very important. I'm going to say it twice. Speak to them and say to them. Another interpretation is that because the priests passed down the priesthood to their sons, there's only one way to become a priest in Israelite nation. That's to be descended from the family of Aaron, the original high priest. Everybody else is excluded. And so priests are supposed to educate their own children about the laws of being a priest, and especially this law about not contaminating yourself with a dead body. So the repetition, speak to the priests and say to them, might be interpreted as say to your children. This is not a one-time commandment. This is every generation. This commandment has to be given over again to the next generation of priests. In general, this is a useful concept for recovery and spiritual wellness in general, that adults should regulate their behavior in front of children, because you're a model for your children, whether you are trying to be or not. You could be the worst human being in the world, and you're being a model for your children. You're just modeling terrible behavior. And unfortunately, we see that a lot in the rooms. Or you could be, spiritually lazy, let's say, and model someone who's, spiritually all over the place. Or you can try and focus on setting a good example for your children. And I think that this is an important thing to consider in recovery for a lot of reasons. One of which is that sometimes after we come out of our addiction, we might realize, hopefully we realize it, or usually it's pointed out to us by someone else, that our behavior has affected our families. And this could be through, all kinds of horrible things that could happen, or just neglect. Maybe you just weren't around for people in your life. Or if you were around, people wished you weren't. I know I've seen that. And this is true whether you're in recovery or drinking or using or being a dry drunk, that we this verse can be a reminder to really focus on our behavior around our families and children. We owe it to them, and we can help improve their lives and improve ours at the same time, because I don't know if you've noticed, but when your family's happy, you're probably happier, right? Leviticus 21:6 says, they, meaning the priests, they shall be holy to their God, and they not desecrate the name of their God. So the priests have a holy responsibility. So they have to carry themselves in a holy way. They can't be in contact with dead bodies. They can't do immoral things or spiritually contaminating things. Now, in AA, we have a tradition that's actually similar, and that is the tradition of anonymity, which is the idea that a sober person may not act in a way that desecrates the name of AA. So in the same way that the priests shall be holy and not desecrate the name of God, if we're good in recovery, we're going to maintain anonymity so that we don't inadvertently desecrate the name of AA. Now you may wonder, how is this possible? And it's one of the most important traditions, meaning they say we maintain anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films, which is obviously now that includes internet and other media that didn't exist in the 1930s. But the reason one of the reasons we stay anonymous is we don't know what the future is going to hold. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot lately, famous people saying, hey, I'm in recovery, I'm sober, and then they relapse. And unfortunately, what this can do is it can make people who are looking at AA say, well, it doesn't really work. If, so-and-so, this famous person, is all boasting about being sober, and now he's not sober, so maybe AA doesn't work, so maybe I won't try it, or I won't recommend it to my relative who's drunk or whatever. So you're desecrating the name of AA, even if you think you're praising it. This is a tricky thing, but we have to be careful about this, and that this verse can remind us to be careful. Leviticus 23:4-23:5 said, these are the appointed festivals of God, the holy convocations, which you shall designate in their appropriate time. In the first month, on the 14th of the month, in the afternoon, is the time of the Pesach offering to God. So what we have here is the introduction of the Bible explaining the timing of some of the major Jewish holidays that the Israelite nation is obligated to observe. Pesach is the Hebrew word for Passover. You probably heard of the Hebrew holiday of Passover. It's one of the major Jewish holidays in the year. And it's what you may not know is that the date and time that it begins comes right out of the Bible. And so the first month in the Hebrew calendar is called Nisan. On the 14th of Nisan, there is the holiday of Passover starts. And you'll notice if you're in a Jewish neighborhood around that time, you'll see people running around, going to the grocery store, getting matzahs and all kinds of things, kosher for Passover food. Now, what is Passover? Passover is the holiday that celebrates the Israelites' freedom from slavery. It's the holiday that celebrates the Exodus, the leaving of the Israelites out of slavery under Pharaoh in Egypt and out into the wilderness to be free. And if you ever want to see a movie about it, there's a movie called The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston playing Moses, and you can see basically the Passover story on the big screen. And Yul Brynner as Pharaoh, he's brilliant. The connection to AA should be fairly intuitive here, which is that addiction is an enslavement of the self. So if you've ever had an AA anniversary, it's like your personal Passover. It's your personal celebration of your liberation from slavery, from the slavery of addiction, and celebration of your freedom. And, AA anniversaries are a big deal, because getting a year of sobriety is a big accomplishment, and it deserves to be recognized. It's also inspiring for newcomers and others who are struggling how did you do it? It's a great question. And in the same way that Passover, which has been observed over 3,000 years in a row straight, is still observed, is because the Israelites are supposed to reflect on what it means to be free and what it means to be not enslaved every year, even though they haven't been enslaved for over 3,000 years. But it's something, once you've been enslaved, you never forget it. And that's the message of this verse. In Leviticus 23:15, it says, "You shall count for yourself from the morrow of the rest of the day, from the day when you bring the omer of the waving, 7 weeks, they shall be complete." Now this sounds pretty obscure. What it means is, it says after Passover you count 7 weeks until the next Jewish holiday, which is called Shavuos or Shavuot, which in the King James Bible I believe is called the Festival of Weeks, because it's defined as 7 weeks after Passover. And so you count 49 days, 7 weeks. And each day of that, you count 49 days starting from the moment when you bring an offering known as the omer, which is an offering of grain. So this is fairly esoteric stuff, but it's important if you want to understand the Jewish calendar and some of the other biblical traditions that come from it. And there's a lot of connections between these two holidays and Christianity. For example, it's understood, I'm pretty sure, that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. So there are connections between this and many, many details in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But for recovery, I think one thing that leaps out at me on this is this idea of counting days. So if you go into a Jewish synagogue during this 49-day period, and you're paying close attention, you'll notice that everybody says a special prayer at the end where they count off the days. They say today's day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And they're saying in Hebrew, so you may not see what they're doing, but it is interesting. They're actually counting it up, and there might be like a sign on the wall with one of those like number things where you tear off the sheets and it says day 1, day 2. It's like every day they tear off another sheet and everybody can see what day it is. So it's a tradition that comes down all the way to this day. And what they're really counting up to is on 49 days after the Israelites were freed from slavery, they received the Torah, the giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. So they're counting up to this great spiritual height. And counting days is, a big part of recovery, especially obviously early recovery. And 49 days is a big deal. If you've gone through your first 49 days clean and sober, it's not an easy 7 weeks, or the first 90 days, or the first 30 days, or even the first week. It's really hard. And if you can make it through, you can make it through anything. And this is the message. Count those days and don't give up. Leviticus 23:21 describes the holiday of Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks. He says, "You shall convoke on this day," Shavuos, "you shall convoke on this day, on this very day, there shall be a holy convocation for yourselves. You shall do no laborious work. It is an eternal decree in your dwelling places for your generations." So this is describing this holiday of Shavuos, or pronounced Shavuot, also known as the Festival of Weeks, that comes 7 weeks after Passover. This holiday is a commemoration of the Israelites receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. This is one of the most momentous events in the history of humanity. The revelation of the divine law that has inspired billions of people throughout the world for thousands of years. And it all started at this one moment. See, this is something, and I think a lot of us know this, but I want to just focus on it for a minute. When you walk into a building that has the 10 Commandments written on the wall or on, sculpture or whatever, or you read the 10 Commandments, you should know that these were revealed at a single moment in time, and that this is the moment on this holiday of Shavuot. Over 3,000 years ago, God revealed himself and his divine law to humanity. And from this we have all of the moral teachings of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But one way to think about it that's maybe a little bit less obvious is is to ask the question, why were the Israelites freed from slavery? So, yes, they were freed so that they could be free. But what does that mean, to be free? This is a question that really should resonate in recovery. What is one supposed to do in the freedom from addiction? So from the Israelite perspective, they were freed from slavery so that they could receive the Torah. And one interpretation of this is that they were freed from slavery to Pharaoh in order to become enslaved to God, to become slaves of the biblical moral law. God did not free them so that they could go off and do whatever they wanted. This is a modern philosophy might call this radical freedom. And this is a very popular concept in American life, that you're completely free to do whatever you want at any time for any reason. And I don't want to argue against that. I think people should be free to do whatever they want. But in recovery, maybe freedom means adopting some spiritual discipline, because probably this freedom to do whatever you want with any person at any time for any reason is probably one of the problems you had in addiction. You're out of control. Being completely free means being out of control. And in order to be free in a constructive way, or to be sober in a constructive way, is to work on developing a good sense of recovery, a good sense of moral balance, and a good sense of spiritual direction. So the goal in reference to this verse, the goal of liberation was to put the Israelites into closer contact with God, closer than they'd ever been before, so that they could become holy and subject to God's law. Similarly, we can get inspired from this in getting free from the slavery of addiction. We can involve ourselves in getting closer to the higher power. So conversely, if we treat recovery as a free pass to follow our bliss and do whatever we want, we're probably heading for trouble. And just an interesting linguistic detail that backs this up, the Hebrew word Shavuot, which means weeks, the festival of weeks, if it's pronounced with slightly different vowels, the same word also means oath or promise. So the Hebrew word for oath or a vow is almost exactly the same as the word for week. So we can think of Shavuos, this day, this festival of weeks, as a day to make a vow, as we might on our first day of recovery or anniversary, to stay in conscious contact with our higher power and be subject to the moral laws of that higher power.
You've been listening to the For I Will Be With You podcast. Daily reflections on recovery from the Bible. www.foriwillbewithyou.com